We're back, and this time with some information about the American border and the trouble on the border and the trouble on the German border, and we're going to psychoanalyze the people who are causing all the problems. Everybody knows that currently we have a lot of trouble on the border, and there's a lot of trouble on the German border too. And this brings up something that has to do with the human mind that's really complicated and that is really interesting, and it'll get to the bottom of why there is a problem on the border. In other words, we're going to ignore politics because everybody else is analyzing the problem from that point of view, and it's really getting nowhere. Everybody knows it. The problem's just getting worse. So how can we do this better? Well, there is a book called Boundaries in the Mind by an author named Ernest Hartmann, who's a doctor. He met Sigmund Freud when he was 2 years old. And his father, the author's father, was also a psychoanalyst. And this guy was a psychoanalyst. And he wrote a book called Boundaries in the Mind. Once again, Boundaries in the Mind. And this explains everything. Everything about everything. The situation on the border, as we know, is really bad. We all know about the families being arrested, the children being separated, and so forth and so on. We do have a problem there, and everybody's trying to analyze it. And we're not the only country in the world with a border problem. We do know that in Germany, under Mrs. Merkel, the Prime Minister, the Chancellor, in other words, there have been an awful lot of migrants into Germany, and she said, we can handle this. But the truth is also that because she has handled it, and handled it not perfectly, but very well, the party that she belongs to that rules Germany is threatening to break apart. Very, very interesting. In other words, it's not just the Americans who are having a problem with migration and domestic problems in their political party situation. It's also happening in Europe. Well, how can we use this book, Boundaries in the Mind, to help us understand all of that? Hartmann came up with a theory, and I believe it, that there are boundaries in the mind that are very, very important. The first one actually deals with the structure of the mind, and a lot of people already know about this. Sigmund Freud and others said that everybody's mind, that's a picture of the mind, has an ego to it, which is your sense of yourself. When you say the word I, you're talking from your ego. We won't go into a lot of detail here. The only point is the mind has three parts. The mind has also an id, which is basically instincts, and it also has a super ego, which is basically the conscience. Everybody has a conscience and a sense of themselves. When they say the word I, that's the ego operating. And when they operate on the basis of instinct, they're talking from their id, or acting from their id. And then there's another division too, namely a division between the conscious mind and the unconscious mind. I apologize for the writing. There is a division between the conscious mind and the unconscious mind. And this is a very simplified map. The only point to remember is that there are boundaries in the mind. And they separate all sorts of things to make life easier, to make life better, and to make life relatively predictable. We'll get to the American border and to the German border and how all of this can explain really what's going on politically. And it can also get to the mind of the president and his adherents and also his opponents. And it's a way of looking at the problem. The psychological way is a way of looking at the border problem and other political problems that actually does raise some great questions and some possible answers. Now, the first thing to know is that boundaries in the mind can be either thick or thin. They can be real thick like this, or they can be relatively thin. Boundaries in the mind can be thick or thin. There are lots and lots of boundary types in the mind. We're just going to fly right through this, and don't try to memorize this. The whole point is there are different kinds of boundaries in everybody's mind. We've already said there's the superego, the ego, and the id, the various divisions that way in the mind. And there are also other things that divide people's minds up. Some people, for instance, are able to focus on one thing at a time really, really well. In other words, they have a very thick boundary in their mind between this object and, let's say, that object. While other people, looking at the very same things, have very thin boundaries, and they tend to see this thing over here combined with that thing. So in other words, their boundaries, which are very, very thin, don't allow them to focus on one thing at once. Some people are just great at that. They focus on one thing at once, nothing else disturbs their image of that, and other people, unfortunately, cannot focus on one single thing. We'll get to that. And also, your thoughts are bounded in your mind. So you might have a thought about, well, I like grapefruits. I like grapefruits quite a lot. The person who says that, I like grapefruits quite a lot, is not thinking at the same time, boy, I hope I can ride an elephant in India next year. I'd really enjoy that. Whereas the person with thin boundaries over here, talking about grapefruits, will be assaulted with pictures of Indian elephants or something like that. So some people can focus real well on particular thoughts and keep all other thoughts out. What about a general sense of awareness? Yes, that's another kind of situation where boundaries are very, very important. Some people wake up in the morning and they feel like, boy, I'm awake, let's go attack the day. Other people wake up in the morning, they're still sort of dreaming, and they need 8 cups of coffee to get themselves going into the day slowly. In other words, their boundary in the mind merges sleeping and waking, whereas the first kind of person who jumps out of bed in the morning doesn't have that problem. There's a real thick boundary between being asleep and being awake. So when they awake, they wake up, and that's all there is to it. Another boundary in the mind has to do with the past. This is really important. A lot of people have thick boundaries between the past and now, or the past and the future. So they have no trouble dismissing, let's say, their childhood. They're not bothered at all by it, no matter what they went through. They have a very thick boundary that separates that. Okay, I had a miserable childhood, but the future's the future. Let's focus on that, and off they go. Other people live more or less continually in the past and in the present and in the future. These time divisions merge. Their boundaries between the various divisions of time, past, present, and future, are very, very soft, very, very thin. And those kinds of people, by the way, are great for psychoanalysis. They hit the couch in the psychoanalyst office. The psychoanalyst says, tell me about your childhood. For hours and hours and hours, they'll go on about their childhood. The people with thin boundaries. The people with thick boundaries would say, I don't remember it, or it doesn't matter. I don't care. Well, there's another kind of boundary too, and that's in interpersonal relationships. As you might predict, the people with these thick boundaries here tend to shield themselves from other people a lot. That doesn't mean they're mean, it just means they shield themselves from other people. People with thin boundaries in the mind tend to see themselves as more or less merging into a larger group. And so they have less of a sense of self as an isolated human being. Very many times, according to Hartmann and other researchers, you'll see that business people have relatively thick boundaries. I'm a business person, I'm selling you this, that's all it's about. People with thin boundaries wouldn't be able to do that. They would think to themselves, this person I'm talking to has certain qualities, characteristics, and maybe a certain income, and I have to adjust what I'm doing because of that. Now, that's not a hard and fast statement that I'm making there. Many business people have thin boundaries too, but classically, they can be thought of as people with very thick boundaries between themselves and what they're doing, and other people and what's going on. And then the last kind of boundary is a group boundary, and that's going to get us into politics. People with thick boundaries tend to say, I live, for instance, in the United States of America, the greatest country in the world, the greatest country there has ever been, and that's that. And in America, we are constantly saturated with that kind of thinking as the standard kind of thinking. unfortunately. If you watch a weather report, for instance, no matter where you are in America, even if you live, as people in New Hampshire do, about an inch from Canada, you're not going to see very many weather reports or hear very many weather reports that mention the weather, let's say, in Toronto. Why would anybody want to hear about Toronto's weather? After all, they're in another country, those people. We don't need to hear about that. We have a thick boundary around the country, and that reflects a very thick boundary inside of our image of the United States of America, especially in some people. So again, it's not really hard to see that some presidents, for instance, might have very, very thick boundaries in their minds where they see themselves as an individual, hardcore businessman, different from everybody else, shielded from everybody else, and the country that they live in is the only country that matters on the planet. And so you can see that a president with that kind of mind would tend to say, we're keeping migrants out, that's it. Zero tolerance, et cetera, et cetera. While other people look at the very same situation, and they're not necessarily better people, nicer people, or more internationally minded. It's just that they have thinner boundaries in their minds. So they don't automatically think, I don't want to hear about the weather in Toronto. They don't automatically think I'm an American and America's the only real country in the world. They don't think that way about anything. When they wake up in the morning, they don't know if they're awake yet, and so forth and so on, along all those other dimensions that I already mentioned. So a lot of times, people's mentality is what determines their attitude towards, again, let's just say the border. And the border problem is not the only political problem that you can look at this way. There are a lot of boundaries that are really thinning out in the world, and I would say that they reflect mental attitudes and mental situations. In other words, they're happening, these thinning boundaries in the world are happening not because we're only dealing with politics and the economy, we're dealing with the human mind. And that's why we have a lot of conflicts today about thinning boundaries and thickening boundaries. For instance, the president has suggested that he should raise tariffs on a lot of goods. That's, again, a thickening boundary. That probably reflects, if I were his psychoanalyst, that probably reflects a tendency in his mind to have rather thick boundaries between things. He probably wakes up in the morning and says, boy, am I awake. Let's get going. Probably doesn't remember his dreams. And on the problem that I just mentioned, he also expresses a situation or a habit where he has thick boundaries. Tariffs against other countries. We need to have that. On the other hand, although he runs around saying, let's make America great again, as if that were a focus on a thick boundaried ideal where only America counts, he also has, and I'm talking about the president, a big drive towards perhaps overcoming thickness of boundaries. And that's why he ran off to Singapore and talked with the leader of North Korea, Mr. Kim. So for some reason or other, he's able to say, towards Korea, maybe we can have a thinner wall between us. But towards the people who are near us, that is Mexico, we need a thick wall. And I would suggest that he can do that because Korea is a long way away. It's already isolated from him already, so the boundaries in his mind towards Korea can be relatively thin. Got a thin shield between us and them, but also a vast distance, whereas Mexico is so close to us that in a way, in the presidential mind, there's a sense of threat, because his brain is constructed that way, that thin boundaries, or rather thick boundaries, rule the day, and thin boundaries are somewhat threatening. Now, the president is not the only person like this. He probably attracts thousands or maybe even millions of people who have the same kind of head, the same kind of mind. It's not that they really think differently about politics, it's that they think differently across the board about everything, in other words. Here's another example of boundaries and borders that are thinning out in the world. CNN, the BBC, and other networks are now broadcasting across the world, around the world. They cover the globe. In other words, there's much less of a boundary between American TV and you who live in India, let's say, or Russia. Just dial it up and you can watch American TV. We can watch German TV over here. Boundaries are definitely thinning in that regard. Things are mixing together. And for people with thick boundaries in their head, again, that's threatening. It's actually mentally somewhat threatening. I don't want to overplay that, but it might make them feel really uncomfortable. What's this Mexican TV outfit doing in my living room? Don't they understand? And so forth and so on. And again, it's not because they're necessarily brutal, vicious, stupid, uneducated people. It's because their heads operate in a certain way, a way that the brains were born to operate in. And that's how and why they look at world problems or world situations the way they do. Take global warming, for instance. It's hard for a lot of people to understand, apparently, that the temperature of the Earth is rising in certain respects and in certain places. And if you can't accept that, I see no problem whatsoever in accepting the idea that it's certainly getting dirtier in a lot of ways. The air is getting dirtier. The environment is getting dirtier. In other words, what a Chinese city sends into the air, we now know does not stop in China. It goes all over the world. And people with certain kinds of boundaries in their head will be offended by that. If they have the right kind of boundary, they will tend to look at global warming, in other words, as a threat. And if they have the wrong kind of boundary in their mind, they'll look at it as something they can safely ignore. Now, that particular point gets very, very complicated. Which kind of boundary in which mind will see global warming as dangerous, and which kind will see it as something you can ignore? You could actually argue, as a matter of fact, on both sides. But the point is that the issue of boundaries in the mind and the boundaries in the mind themselves will cause a person perhaps to see an issue like global warming in a certain way. It's because, not because they're not scientific, it's because they have certain kinds of boundaries in their mind. By the way, these boundaries are born in your mind, according to Hartmann, which is, I think, very, very believable. It's not something that you're trained to adopt or to adapt. You were born with certain kinds of boundaries in your mind that make you feel comfortable thinking one way or thinking the other way. All right, now that takes care of the international scene. What about domestically? We'll just go through a couple problems to illustrate again that boundaries in the mind are very, very important. Imagine you're on the Supreme Court in the 50s in a highly segregated country, the USA. And a little girl comes up to you and says, well, I'm black and I would like to go to the white school. It's a better school and it's nearby. You're on the Supreme Court. If you have thin boundaries in your mind, it doesn't bother you at all to think that a child of one race can go to school with children of another race. If you have thick boundaries in your mind, you're going to probably want to think in the opposite way. And again, it doesn't make you a racist one way or the other. It's a habit of your mind that you're born with. And people with very, very thick boundaries undoubtedly found it harder in the 50s on the Supreme Court to accept the idea, boy, black and white can mix in one school. So again, what I'm pleading for here is understanding conservatives who come down on the conservative side of an issue. They are often branded as, let's say, mean or racist and so forth, and it's actually just a question of how they think, how their brains work, and it takes a lot of understanding to get past that if you're a liberal like me. Another example of thinning boundaries is the rash of mergers that the country's now going through, where AT&T, for instance, is now merging with, it looks like, Time Warner, which means one giant corporation is going to provide the electronics for cable TV and so forth, while another giant corporation is marrying them and will provide the contents of programming and so forth. How convenient for those corporations. We used to have a country where corporations like that were kept more apart so that there would be more competition and the consumer would benefit. Now, however, it looks as though those boundaries are dissolving. Where that's going to go, I'm not entirely sure, and I'm not entirely sure how that reflects the mind. But again, people with certain boundaries in their mind will be able to accept that, while other people with other boundaries in their mind might be forced to take a different look at the issue simply because of the way their brains work. What about, here's a big one, social norms? Are social norms also taking on different boundaries? I would say yes. There used to be some sort of a thick boundary between the people and certain actions. There used to be, in other words, let's say a bunch of laws that said people can't get together to do this particular thing. And now we're seeing, at least in the case of one, I think, out of control representative, actually telling people, small mobs maybe, look, if you see somebody in the government that you don't like at a gas station, get together and do something about that. And the language that that representative was using was, at least in my estimation, quite dangerous. This was the thinning of a boundary between legality and illegality. And what we need there is an approach, I think, that says, let's thicken that boundary back up in our minds so that we don't see a mob as able to and legally justified in ganging up on somebody, either at a restaurant or at a gas station. This could be a question, in other words, of psychology, not necessarily just politics. Another aspect of thick and thin boundaries in the mind has to do with one last point, and that is economic inequality. We live in a country where there is a great deal of economic inequality. Equality is much more pronounced. Equality, not inequality. Equality is much more pronounced in almost all the countries of the modern world. In the United States, there is economic inequality. In other words, there is a question here of how to look at the boundaries between people who are rich and the boundaries between people who are in the middle class and the boundaries between them and the people who are absolutely pure. Should we adopt a thick attitude, a thick boundary attitude towards all of these groups? Should we say, in other words, well, if you're rich, you're rich, and that's all there is to it. We can't do anything about it. If you're poor and not rich, that's life. And if you're in the middle class, well, at least you've got middle class values and a middle class lifestyle. Be happy. Other people, perhaps with thinner boundaries in their mind, will say, wait a second, there shouldn't be these boundaries between people. People should be able to rise up from the lower classes and enjoy the benefits of a richer lifestyle. That's the attitude that obtains in many countries of the world, especially in places like Germany and to some extent in France, to a large extent in France, and to some extent in Britain. And as a result of economic inequality, here's the big question. Where you have economic inequality, is there a boundary between that and a bad lifestyle, especially between riches or inequality? Is there a boundary between that and, let's say, mental illness in a society? A long time ago, at least 50 years ago, a wonderful analyst named Erich Fromm wrote about that. And he said that conditions in a society, if they're not right, can actually lead to more mental illness and unhappiness in general among people. Now, we all kind of know that, but he said it in a way that was more analytical than other people had said. And again, the point is, do economic conditions and economic inequality lead to unhappier lives in a country to such an extent that there's actually more mental illness in a society that has a great deal of inequality? Or is there a nice thick border between economic inequality and mental illness and general depression and unhappiness? There is research, believe it or not, that says that in a place with a lot of economic inequality, there's more schizophrenia, there's more suicide, there are more deaths due to opiates, and so forth. So that's a tour of the situation with regard to mental boundaries. Some people have thick boundaries in their minds, and that can lead them to think this about politics. Some people have thin boundaries in their mind, and that can lead them to think a different way about politics. So hopefully there's a thin boundary between our program and our audience, and everybody can interact with each other and lead on to more questions and perhaps more answers.